The morning sun cast long shadows through the tall glass windows of Brighton Community Bank as Mrs. Dorothy Washington slowly made her way up the granite steps. At 73 years old, she took each step carefully, clutching her worn leather handbag close to her chest. Inside that bag were precious documents about her late husband's estate, papers she had carefully organized the night before. The bank hadn't changed much in the 40 years she'd been coming here. The same marble floors gleamed under the bright lights, and the same mahogany counters lined the walls. But the faces had changed. None of the friendly tellers who used to greet her by name remained. Her husband, James Washington, had always told her to keep their accounts at this bank, even when newer ones opened closer to their home. "A bank is built on trust, Dorothy," he would say, patting her hand gently. "And trust is built over time." As she pushed through the heavy glass doors, the cool air conditioning hit her face. She'd dressed carefully that morning in her Sunday best. A pale blue dress she often wore to church, sensible black shoes polished to a shine, and a small pearl necklace James had given her on their 30th anniversary. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, just as it had been during her 35 years of teaching at Lincoln Elementary School. The bank was already busy, despite it being only 9:30 in the morning. Men in expensive suits rushed past her, barely noticing as she steadied herself against a pillar. Young professionals stood in line, typing away on their phones, while bank employees in crisp uniforms moved quickly behind their counters. Dorothy took a moment to catch her breath, her eyes scanning the familiar space. So much had changed since James passed away 3 months ago. Their son, Marcus, had tried to help her with the paperwork, but she had insisted on handling it herself. "I'm not too old to take care of my own business," she had told him firmly. Marcus had smiled, just like his father used to, and hugged her tightly. What Dorothy didn't know was that Marcus had become much more than the successful investment banker she was so proud of. Her son had been making moves in the financial world that would have made James burst with pride. But Dorothy had always believed in handling things properly, and today she was here to sort out James's accounts, just as a devoted wife should. She walked toward the help desk, where two young employees were chatting and laughing. The woman, whose nameplate read Sarah Mills, was showing something on her phone to her colleague, a tall man whose tag identified him as James Cooper. Neither looked up as Dorothy approached the desk. Dorothy cleared her throat softly. "Excuse me," she said, using the same gentle but firm tone she had once used to quiet rowdy third graders. "I need to speak with someone about my husband's accounts." Sarah Mills finally looked up, her eyes quickly scanning Dorothy from head to toe. The smile that had been on her face while talking to her colleague disappeared. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, her voice carrying a hint of impatience. "No, I don't," Dorothy replied, reaching into her handbag. "But I've been banking here for 40 years, and I need to discuss my late husband's estate." Her fingers touched the carefully organized papers inside. James Cooper leaned forward now, his expression making it clear he was already dismissing her. "Ma'am, for estate matters, you need to make an appointment. We can't just have people walking in off the street demanding to see our managers." Dorothy stood straighter, all 5 feet 2 inches of her. She might be elderly, but she had taught generations of children in this community, and she knew when someone was being condescending. "Young man," she began, her voice steady, "I am not people walking in off the street. I am Mrs. Dorothy Washington, and my husband and I have been customers here since before you were born." The two employees exchanged a look that Dorothy had seen many times before, a look that made her heart sink but her spine stiffen. She had hoped things would have changed more by 2025, but some things, it seemed, remained the same. What she didn't realize was that this ordinary Monday morning was about to become anything but ordinary, and the two employees smirking at her were about to learn a valuable lesson about judging books by their covers. Sarah Mills drummed her perfectly manicured nails on the desk as she stared at Mrs. Washington. "Ma'am," she said, stretching out the word like a piece of gum, "I've already told you that you need an appointment. It doesn't matter how long you've been banking here." Mrs. Washington opened her handbag and pulled out a thick envelope filled with carefully organized papers. "These are my husband's death certificate, our account documents, and letters from this very bank dating back to 1985, she explained, her voice remaining calm despite the growing knot in her stomach. "Surely someone can spare a few minutes to look at them." James Cooper stood up from his chair, towering over the elderly woman. "Listen, we have very important clients waiting." This isn't a community center where you can just walk in and chat. He gestured toward the door. Come back when you have an appointment. A few other customers in line had started to notice the exchange. One young woman in a business suit frowned, her phone halfway to her ear as she watched the scene unfold. An elderly man with a cane shook his head disapprovingly at the employee's behavior. Mrs. Washington thought about all the times she and James had visited this bank together. How the old manager, Mr. Peterson, would invite them into his office for coffee while they discussed their accounts. How they'd saved every penny to put Marcus through the best schools. Her late husband's words echoed in her mind. Always carry yourself with dignity, Dorothy, no matter how others treat you. I understand you're busy, Mrs. Washington said, straightening her pearl necklace with one hand. But these are important legal matters that need attention. Could you at least check if anyone is available? Sarah let out an exaggerated sigh and picked up her phone, pressing a button with excessive force. Security? Yes, we have a situation at the help desk. She paused, looking directly at Mrs. Washington. Someone is refusing to leave. Mrs. Washington's heart began to race, but her face remained composed, the same expression she had worn when facing difficult parent-teacher conferences or handling troublesome students. There's no need to call security. I'm simply asking to speak with a manager about my husband's estate. Two security guards appeared almost immediately, their heavy boots squeaking against the marble floor. The taller one, whose badge read Officer Wilson, spoke first. What seems to be the problem here? Before Mrs. Washington could explain, James Cooper jumped in. This woman won't leave. We told her repeatedly that she needs an appointment for estate matters, but she keeps insisting. Young man, Mrs. Washington began, I have all the necessary documentation right here. Ma'am, Officer Wilson interrupted, his hand moving to rest on her shoulder. You need to leave the premises now, or we'll be forced to remove you. More customers had stopped their transactions to watch. Several had pulled out their phones, recording the incident. Mrs. Washington could feel her cheeks burning with humiliation, but she held her head high. I taught in this community for 35 years, she said, her voice slightly trembling but still dignified. My husband and I have millions in accounts here. We helped build this community when others wouldn't invest in it. Sarah Mills laughed openly now. Millions? Right. And I'm the Queen of England. She turned to the security guards. Please escort her out before she causes more disruption. The second security guard moved forward, and together with Officer Wilson, they each took one of Mrs. Washington's arms. The touch wasn't gentle. Her handbag slipped, spilling some of her carefully organized papers across the floor. Please, Mrs. Washington said, watching as people stepped over her documents. Those are important papers. But the guards were already moving her toward the door. Sarah and James watched from their desk, smirking. Other bank employees turned away, pretending not to see what was happening. A few customers muttered under their breath, some in support of Mrs. Washington, others just wanting the disruption to end so they could get on with their day. As they reached the door, Mrs. Washington thought about calling her son Marcus. He would be furious if he knew how she was being treated. But she had always handled things on her own, and even now, being forcefully ejected from her bank of 40 years, she maintained her dignity. What Sarah Mills, James Cooper, and the rest of Brighton Community Bank's staff didn't know was that their actions were being recorded not just by customers' phones, but by the bank's own security cameras. And very soon, those recordings would be watched by someone whose opinion mattered far more than they could imagine. The bright morning sun hit Mrs. Washington's face as the security guards pushed open the heavy glass doors of Brighton Community Bank. Behind her, she could hear the whispers and murmurs of other customers. Some were still recording with their phones, their cameras capturing every moment of her humiliation. Don't come back without an appointment, Officer Wilson said gruffly, finally releasing her arm. The other guard had already turned away, heading back inside. Mrs. Washington's shoulder ached where they had gripped her, but she refused to show any pain. A young woman in a red business suit rushed out after her. Ma'am, she called, holding out some papers that had fallen from Mrs. Washington's handbag during the chaos. You dropped these. Her kind eyes showed concern, a stark contrast to the bank employee's cold stares. Thank you, dear, Mrs. Washington said softly, accepting the scattered documents. Her hands trembled slightly as she tried to put them back in order. The death certificate she had so carefully protected now had a shoe print across its corner. Inside the bank, Sarah Mills and James Cooper had already returned to their morning chat, laughing as if nothing had happened. Through the glass doors, Mrs. Washington could see them mimicking her words about having millions in the bank. Another employee joined them, and soon all three were chuckling at what they clearly thought was a ridiculous claim. Mrs. Washington sat down heavily on a bench near the bank's entrance. She needed a moment to collect herself before calling a taxi to go home. As she waited, more customers exited the bank, some avoiding eye contact while others offered sympathetic glances. A few stopped to talk to her. "What they did wasn't right," said an elderly man, leaning on his cane. "I saw the whole thing. You should report them." A young mother with two small children nodded in agreement. "I got it all on video," she said, holding up her phone. "This is going straight to social media. People need to see how they treat their customers." Mrs. Washington thanked them for their kindness but felt a deep sadness. In all her years of teaching, she had tried to show her students that times were changing, that people should be judged by their character, not their appearance. Yet here she was, in 2025, being thrown out of her own bank because two young employees couldn't believe that an elderly black woman might have significant accounts. Her phone buzzed in her handbag. It was a text from Marcus. "Mom, are you okay? Someone just sent me a video of something happening at Brighton Bank. Is that you?" Before she could reply, more messages started coming in. Her former students, neighbors, and church members were all reaching out. The videos were already spreading across social media platforms, causing outrage in the community. Mrs. Washington's hands shook as she tried to type a response to Marcus. Inside the bank, the atmosphere had started to shift. A regional manager had just called, demanding to know why Brighton Community Bank was trending on local social media. Sarah Mills's smirk had disappeared as she scrolled through her own phone, seeing hundreds of angry comments on the bank's social media pages. James Cooper was now frantically explaining to his supervisor that the elderly woman had been disruptive and wouldn't follow proper procedures. But his voice wavered as he watched more and more customers walking out, some closing their accounts in protest. The young woman in the red suit, who had helped Mrs. Washington with her papers, stood at Sarah's desk. "She was trying to show you her documents," she said angrily. "I saw them when I picked them up. That was a death certificate and official bank papers. You didn't even look at them." Outside, Mrs. Washington finally managed to text Marcus back. "I'm fine, son. Don't worry about me. Some people just haven't learned yet." What she didn't know was that Marcus had already seen 3 different videos of the incident. His mother's calm dignity in the face of such treatment made his blood boil. As the CEO of Washington Investment Group and the new majority shareholder of Brighton Community Bank's parent company, he was about to show Sarah Mills, James Cooper, and everyone else exactly who they had just thrown out of their bank. But first, he needed to make sure his mother was okay. Within minutes, his personal driver would arrive to pick her up, and by tomorrow morning, the employees who had treated her so poorly would learn a lesson they would never forget. Marcus Washington sat in his corner office on the 47th floor of downtown's most prestigious building, watching the videos of his mother's treatment for the 3rd time. His hand gripped his phone so tightly his knuckles had turned white. On his desk, multiple screens showed news websites and social media platforms, all buzzing with the story of how Brighton Community Bank had treated an elderly customer. "Mr. Washington," his assistant Jessica called through the intercom. "The board of directors is assembled in the conference room for the emergency meeting you called." Marcus stood up, straightening his perfectly tailored suit. At 45 years old, he had built himself into one of the most powerful figures in the banking industry. The Washington Investment Group, which he had started from scratch, now controlled billions in assets. 3 months ago, when he had secretly acquired majority ownership of Brighton Community Bank's parent company, he had planned to announce it at the end of the quarter. But now, watching his mother being manhandled out of a bank where she had been a customer for 40 years made him change his plans entirely. The conference room fell silent as Marcus walked in. 12 board members sat around the massive mahogany table, their faces showing varying degrees of concern and confusion. None of them yet knew why they had been summoned for this emergency meeting. "Play the videos," Marcus commanded, his voice steady but filled with controlled anger. On the large screen at the end of the room, the security footage from Brighton Community Bank began to play. The board members watched in horror as the scene unfolded. Mrs. Washington being dismissed, security being called, her papers scattered across the floor. Then came the cell phone videos from different customers, showing multiple angles of the incident. "That woman," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the shocked silence, "is my mother, Mrs. Dorothy Washington. She and my late father have been customers at Brighton Community Bank for 40 years. They have multiple high-value accounts there. And today, she was treated like a criminal for trying to handle my father's estate matters." One of the board members, an elderly man named Richard Peters, removed his glasses with shaking hands. "Marcus, I had no idea. When did this happen?" "This morning," Marcus replied, touching a button on his tablet. New documents appeared on everyone's screens. 3 months ago, the Washington Investment Group acquired a controlling interest in Brighton Banking Corporation, making me the majority owner of not just that branch, but the entire banking network. The room erupted in shocked whispers. Marcus held up his hand for silence. "I had planned to announce this at the end of the quarter, but today's events have forced my hand. The two employees, Sarah Mills and James Cooper, along with their immediate supervisor, will need to be dealt with. But this goes beyond just firing a few people." He walked to the window, looking out over the city skyline. "My mother was a teacher in this community for 35 years. My father worked 2 jobs to build our savings, and they chose Brighton Community Bank because they believed in supporting local businesses. They believed in building relationships based on trust and respect." Marcus turned back to face the board. "What happened today shows a systemic problem in our banking culture. The assumption that an elderly black woman couldn't possibly have significant accounts. The refusal to even look at her documentation. The immediate resort to calling security." The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Many had already seen their phones lighting up with messages about the viral videos and growing public outrage. "By the end of today," Marcus continued, "every major news outlet will have this story. Our stock price is already dropping. More importantly, we have betrayed the trust of our customers and our community." He pressed another button, and a new document appeared on their screens. "This is my plan for immediate and long-term changes in our banking practices. Diversity training is just the beginning. We're going to transform how this bank serves our community." As the board members began reading through his proposal, Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "Son, please don't be too harsh with those young people at the bank. They need education, not punishment." Marcus smiled slightly, recognizing his mother's lifelong dedication to teaching and helping others learn from their mistakes. She was right, as usual. This wasn't just about punishment, it was about transformation. And tomorrow morning, when he walked into that bank branch with his mother, the real changes would begin. The sun was setting over the city as Sarah Mills and James Cooper finished their shift at Brighton Community Bank. Neither of them felt like celebrating the end of their workday. Their phones had been buzzing non-stop with notifications from social media, where the videos of Mrs. Washington's treatment had gone viral. Even their families had called, asking if they were the ones in the trending videos. "It's not our fault," Sarah muttered, gathering her things. "She should have made an appointment like everyone else." James nodded weakly, but his confidence from the morning had disappeared. He had watched the security footage during his lunch break, and seeing their actions from a different angle made him uncomfortable. The way Mrs. Washington had maintained her dignity while they mocked her, how gentle she had been even when security was called, it all looked very different on video. Their manager, Tom Bradley, called them both into his office before they could leave. His face was pale, and sweat stained the collar of his shirt. "We have an emergency staff meeting tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. Attendance is mandatory." He paused, wiping his forehead. "The CEO of our parent company is coming personally." "The CEO?" Sarah's voice cracked. "Why would he care about one customer complaint?" Tom handed them each a folder. "Review these documents tonight. They show Mrs. Washington's account history with our bank." His hands were shaking. "She and her late husband have over $3 million in various accounts with us. They're one of our oldest and most valuable customers." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face as she opened the folder. There it was in black and white. Account statements showing millions in deposits, investments, and securities. She remembered how she had laughed when Mrs. Washington mentioned having millions in the bank. Across town, in a luxurious penthouse apartment, Marcus Washington was having dinner with his mother. He had insisted she stay with him tonight, wanting to make sure she was okay after the morning's events. "Marcus," Mrs. Washington said, putting down her fork. "I've been thinking about those young people at the bank." "Mom, what they did was inexcusable," Marcus replied, but his mother raised her hand to stop him. "In my 35 years of teaching," she continued, "I learned that the best lessons come from understanding our mistakes, not just being punished for them." She reached across the table and patted his hand. "Those young people didn't see me as a person with dignity and history. They need to learn, not just lose their jobs." Marcus looked at his mother with admiration. Even after being humiliated, she was thinking about teaching and helping others grow. It reminded him of how she used to handle difficult situations in her classroom, always finding ways to turn mistakes into learning opportunities. Back at the bank, the cleaning staff was finishing up for the night when several expensive cars pulled up outside. A team of its specialists and corporate investigators walked in, heading straight for the security office. They would spend the next several hours going through every camera angle, every computer record, and every transaction from the day. In their homes, Sarah and James lay awake, reading through Mrs. Washington's account histories. They learned about James Washington Sr.'s smart investments in the 1980s, the college fund they had built for their son Marcus, and the community development projects they had supported through the bank. Sarah found herself crying as she read Mrs. Washington's customer profile. For 40 years, she had volunteered at local schools, helped fund community programs, and maintained a perfect banking record. The profile even mentioned that she brought cookies to the bank staff every Christmas, at least she used to, before all the old employees had left. James couldn't sleep at all. He kept thinking about his own grandmother, who had faced similar prejudice at businesses in the past. He had promised himself he would never be like those people who had disrespected her, yet today he had done exactly that to someone else's grandmother. What neither of them knew was that tomorrow's meeting would change not just their careers, but their entire perspective on life. Marcus Washington had spent the evening developing a response plan that would transform Brighton Community Bank from the inside out, and it would start with the two employees who had thrown his mother out of her own bank. At exactly 7:45 a.m. the next morning, 3 black luxury cars pulled up in front of Brighton Community Bank. Sarah Mills and James Cooper, who had arrived early for the mandatory meeting, watched through the windows as a group of people stepped out. Their eyes widened as they recognized Mrs. Washington among them, looking elegant in a cream-colored suit. But it was the tall man helping Mrs. Washington out of the car who caught everyone's attention. Dressed in an expensive dark suit and carrying a leather briefcase, he had the confident walk of someone used to being in charge. Several other executives followed behind them. "That's Marcus Washington," Tom Bradley, their manager, whispered. "CEO of Washington Investment Group and," he swallowed hard, "our new majority owner." Sarah felt her legs go weak. James had to grab a desk to steady himself. The man whose mother they had thrown out of the bank yesterday was their new boss. The bank's security guards, different ones from yesterday, rushed to open the doors. As Mrs. Washington walked in, every employee present noticed how she carried herself with the same quiet dignity she had shown the day before, even when being mistreated. Marcus Washington's voice filled the lobby. "Good morning, everyone. I believe we have some important matters to discuss." He gestured toward the bank's conference room. "Shall we?" Sarah and James followed the group into the conference room, their feet feeling like lead. Other bank employees crowded in behind them, including the security guards from yesterday, who had also been called in for the meeting. Once everyone was seated, Marcus opened his briefcase and took out a tablet. With one touch, the large screen on the wall came to life, showing the videos from yesterday. Sarah wanted to sink into her chair as she watched herself laughing at Mrs. Washington's claims about having millions in the bank. "My mother," Marcus began, his voice calm but firm, "came to this bank yesterday to handle some paperwork regarding my late father's estate." He paused the video. "An estate, I might add, that includes significant holdings in this very bank, which makes her not just a customer, but one of our largest shareholders." The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Mrs. Washington sat beside her son, her face showing not anger, but something that looked more like hope. "However," Marcus continued, "this meeting isn't just about my mother. It's about every customer who has ever been judged by their appearance, age, or race." He played more clips, showing how other customers had reacted to the incident, the social media storm that followed, and the news coverage that was still growing. Sarah couldn't hold back her tears anymore. "Mrs. Washington," she said, her voice shaking, "I am so sorry." We were completely wrong, and our behavior was inexcusable. James stood up, his face pale but determined. I apologize too. What we did was discriminatory and shameful. I would understand if you want us fired immediately. To everyone's surprise, Mrs. Washington spoke up. Marcus, may I? When he nodded, she turned to face Sarah and James. In my years of teaching, I learned that the biggest mistakes often lead to the most important lessons. She stood up, smoothing her cream suit. Yesterday, you saw an elderly black woman and made assumptions about her worth, both financial and personal. Today, you're learning that appearances can be deceiving, but more importantly, that every person deserves to be treated with respect, regardless of what you assume about their bank account. Marcus watched his mother with pride before addressing the room again. Following my mother's wisdom, we're not here to fire anyone today. Sarah and James looked up in shock. Instead, we're going to use this incident as a catalyst for real change. He clicked to a new slide showing a comprehensive plan. Starting today, Brighton Community Bank will undergo a complete transformation in how we treat every customer. Mrs. Sarah Mills and Mr. James Cooper, you two will be directly involved in helping develop and implement our new training programs, sharing your experience as a lesson in why we must do better. The tension in the room began to shift into something else, not relief exactly, but hope. As Marcus outlined his plans for change, Mrs. Washington watched the faces of the young employees who had dismissed her yesterday. She saw in them what she had seen in countless students over the years: the dawn of understanding, the recognition of mistakes, and the potential for growth. 1 month after the incident, Brighton Community Bank looked very different. The physical space remained the same, marble floors still gleamed, and mahogany counters still lined the walls, but the atmosphere had transformed completely. New signs welcomed customers in multiple languages, and the staff now reflected the diversity of the community they served. Sarah Mills sat in what used to be her help desk, now transformed into a welcome center. She watched as Mrs. Washington walked in, carrying her familiar leather handbag. Several employees immediately greeted her by name, but not because she was the owner's mother. This had become standard practice for all regular customers. "Good morning, Mrs. Washington," Sarah said, standing up to greet her. "Would you like some tea while we finish processing those documents for your husband's estate?" Mrs. Washington smiled warmly. "Thank you, Sarah. And how are your diversity training sessions going?" Sarah's face brightened. Over the past month, she had gone from being nearly fired to becoming one of the key speakers in the bank's new training program. She shared her story with every new employee, using her own mistakes as a powerful lesson in why assumptions and prejudice had no place in banking or anywhere else. "The sessions are going well," Sarah replied. "Actually, James and I are speaking at 3 other branches next week. Your story, our story, it's making a real difference." Across the lobby, James Cooper was helping an elderly Vietnamese couple open a new account. A month ago, he might have directed them to make an appointment or asked for a translator. Now, he was using a tablet with translation software that Marcus had implemented across all branches, making banking services accessible to everyone. The biggest changes, however, weren't just in how the bank looked or operated. Marcus Washington had kept his promise about transformation, implementing a series of sweeping changes that went far beyond typical corporate diversity training. First, he established the Dorothy Washington Education Fund, committing $10 million to provide scholarships for underprivileged students in the community. Mrs. Washington herself chaired the selection committee, bringing her decades of teaching experience to help choose deserving recipients. Second, the bank launched a community banking program that specifically focused on helping minority-owned businesses and elderly customers navigate their financial needs. The program offered special services, including home visits for elderly customers who couldn't easily come to the bank. Third, every employee, from security guards to top executives, now underwent monthly training sessions that included real-world scenarios and cultural sensitivity workshops. But unlike typical corporate training, these sessions were led by community members who shared their actual banking experiences. Sarah and James have become unexpected champions of these changes. Their honest sharing of how they had misjudged Mrs. Washington and their visible transformation made the training sessions powerful and real. Other employees could relate to their story, recognizing their own biases and learning how to overcome them. Mrs. Washington had also taken an active role in the bank's transformation. Drawing from her teaching background, she helped design training programs that focused on understanding rather than punishment. She often reminded everyone that change comes from the heart, not just from rules. One of the most significant changes was the creation of the Community Advisory Board, which included representatives from various local communities. They met monthly to provide feedback on the bank's services and suggest improvements. Mrs. Washington served as the board's honorary chairperson, bringing her unique perspective as both a longtime customer and someone who had experienced discrimination firsthand. As Sarah watched Mrs. Washington chatting with other customers in the lobby, she remembered how differently things could have turned out. Instead of losing their jobs, she and James had been given the chance to be part of something important, real, meaningful change in how banks served their communities. "Sarah," Mrs. Washington called, interrupting her thoughts, "would you join me for lunch today? I'd love to hear your ideas for the next training session." Sarah smiled, feeling grateful for this remarkable woman who had turned what could have been the worst day of her career into an opportunity for growth. As they walked together toward the break room, other employees watched with admiration, seeing in their relationship a powerful symbol of how understanding and forgiveness could transform not just a bank, but an entire community. 6 months after the incident that changed everything, Brighton Community Bank hosted a special community celebration. The bank's lobby had been transformed into an event space, with photos showing the bank's 60-year history displayed on the walls. At the center was a new plaque dedicating the building as the James and Dorothy Washington Financial Center. Mrs. Washington stood near the plaque, greeting guests as they arrived. She wore her pearl necklace, the same one she had worn on that fateful day 6 months ago, but today it was paired with a beautiful new blue suit Marcus had bought her for the occasion. Her silver hair was neatly styled, and her smile was warm and genuine as she welcomed everyone. Sarah Mills and James Cooper, now promoted to Community Relations Directors, moved through the crowd, sharing their story with reporters who had come to cover the bank's remarkable transformation. The incident that could have ended their careers had instead become a powerful story of change and redemption that was inspiring banks across the country. "Mrs. Washington taught us that everyone has value," Sarah told a reporter, her voice full of emotion. "Now, when I look at any customer walking through those doors, I see a person with their own story, their own dignity, their own worth." James nodded in agreement. "We've helped train staff at 20 other banks in the past 6 months," he added. "Our mistake became a lesson that's changing the entire banking industry." Marcus Washington stood at the podium, preparing to address the gathered crowd. The changes he had implemented had done more than just transform one bank, they had started a movement. Brighton Community Bank's new policies had been featured in financial magazines, and other banks were now copying their community-focused approach. 6 months ago, Marcus began, "An incident in this very lobby showed us how much work we still needed to do. But thanks to my mother's wisdom and forgiveness, that moment of shame became an opportunity for real change." He gestured to the crowd, where customers of all ages, races, and backgrounds mingled together. The bank's new Community Advisory Board members sat in the front row, representing the diverse neighborhood the bank served. Among them was the young woman in the red suit who had helped Mrs. Washington pick up her papers that day. She now headed the bank's new Customer Advocacy Department. The Dorothy Washington Education Fund has already provided scholarships to 50 students, Marcus continued. Our new community banking program has helped hundreds of small businesses secure loans. And our senior banking services now include free transportation to the bank for elderly customers. In the audience, some of the scholarship recipients beamed proudly. They wore special pins identifying them as Washington Scholars, and many had already secured internships at the bank for the coming summer. Mrs. Washington stepped up to join her son at the podium. The crowd broke into applause, many rising to their feet. She raised her hand for quiet, and the room fell silent. "Teaching was my life's work," she said, her voice clear and strong. "For 35 years, I taught children that everyone deserves respect, that mistakes can be learned from, and that change is always possible." She looked at Sarah and James with motherly pride. 6 months ago, I got to teach one more lesson, perhaps the most important one of all." The celebration continued into the evening. Local community members shared stories of how the bank's new programs had helped them. Small business owners talked about getting their first loans. Elderly customers praised the new home banking services. Young scholarship recipients spoke about their dreams for the future. As the event wound down, Mrs. Washington sat in a comfortable chair near the new plaque, watching everyone with satisfaction. Sarah brought her a cup of tea. She knew exactly how Mrs. Washington liked it now. "Did you ever imagine that day would lead to all this?" Sarah asked, sitting beside her. Mrs. Washington smiled, touching her pearl necklace. "In my years of teaching, I learned that the best lessons often come from unexpected moments. That day, we all became students again, learning about dignity, respect, and the power of forgiveness." She looked around the transformed bank, at the diverse faces of customers and employees, at the photos showing their journey of change, at her son talking with community members, and at the plaque that would remind future generations of the day when one woman's dignity helped transform not just a bank, but an entire community's way of thinking. Sometimes, Mrs. Washington said softly, "The most important changes come not from fighting what's wrong, but from teaching what's right."